we're covering what can only be described as one of the most extraordinary political and constitutional moments in American history. Earlier today, the United States Senate voted to convict a sitting president on impeachment charges, and for the first time ever, that conviction has led to removal from office. But this story doesn't end there. In fact, what's unfolding right now may be even more consequential than the vote itself. Let me walk you through what happened, how we got here, and why the next several hours could determine the future of American democracy. This afternoon, just before 4:00 p.m. Eastern Time, Chief Justice John Roberts presided over the final roll call in the Senate chamber. The question before the body was straightforward. Should the president be convicted on the articles of impeachment? A two-thirds majority, 67 votes out of 100 senators, was required for conviction. The chamber was silent as the clerk began calling each senator's name in alphabetical order. One by one, senators responded either guilty or not guilty. The process took roughly 17 minutes, and as the tally grew, it became increasingly clear that this was not going to be a party-line vote. When the count was finalized and reported to the Chief Justice, the numbers were stunning. 68 senators voted to convict, while 32 voted to acquit. That's one vote more than the constitutional threshold. The president had been convicted on all three articles of impeachment. Chief Justice Roberts stood, and in a moment that has never occurred before in over 2 centuries of American governance, he announced that the president was convicted and under the Constitution removed from office effective immediately. The reaction in the chamber was immediate and deeply divided. Some senators rose to their feet in applause. Others sat motionless, visibly shocked. It was a scene that reflected the gravity and the controversy of what had just transpired. Now, let's talk about the math, because this is where the story gets particularly significant. All 51 senators who caucus with the Democrats, including independents, voted to convict. But conviction required 67 votes, which meant at least 16 Republicans had to cross party lines. In the end, 17 Republicans voted guilty. That's a remarkable number. And it didn't happen by accident. The pivotal moment came when Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell's name was called. McConnell, who has been a dominant figure in Republican Senate politics for nearly 2 decades, stood and clearly stated guilty on all 3 articles. McConnell's decision had an immediate ripple effect. His vote signaled to other Republicans that it was acceptable, perhaps even necessary, to vote for conviction, and they followed. The 17 Republicans who voted to convict include some of the most well-known names in the party: Mitt Romney of Utah, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, Susan Collins of Maine, Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, and others. Some, like Romney, had previously voted to convict in earlier impeachment proceedings. But others had not publicly indicated how they would vote, making their decision a surprise. 2 names in particular stood out: Roger Marshall of Kansas and Cindy Hyde Smith of Mississippi. Neither had signaled their intentions ahead of time, and both are considered reliable conservatives. After the vote, both issued statements explaining that the evidence presented, particularly allegations that the president defied a Supreme Court ruling, was simply too serious to ignore. So, what exactly was the president convicted of? There were 3 articles of impeachment. The first article accused the president of defying the authority of the Supreme Court. The allegation was that the president refused to comply with a direct order from the nation's highest court, undermining the separation of powers and the rule of law. The second article concerned the abuse of emergency powers. The claim here was that the president invoked emergency authorities in ways that exceeded constitutional limits, consolidating power in the executive branch unlawfully. The third article was obstruction of justice. This involved allegations that the president obstructed investigations, withheld evidence, and interfered with lawful proceedings. The Senate found the president guilty on all three counts, and under the Constitution, conviction on any one of these articles is sufficient for removal. The president refuses to leave. Within minutes of the Senate's decision, the now former president issued a statement on social media, and this is where the situation takes a dramatic and unprecedented turn. The statement read, "The Senate vote is illegitimate and void. I do not accept this conviction. I remain President of the United States. I will continue executing my duties, and I will not leave the White House." Let that sink in for a moment. A president removed by a constitutional process is publicly declaring that he does not accept the legitimacy of that process and will not comply with it. This statement was posted at 4:07 p.m., just 3 minutes after Chief Justice Roberts announced the conviction. That timing suggests the statement was written in advance. The former president was prepared to reject the Senate's verdict before it was even delivered. And now, the United States faces a crisis unlike any it has encountered before. Two individuals claiming to be president with no clear immediate resolution in sight. Under the Constitution, when a president is removed from office, the vice president immediately becomes president. There's no ceremony required, no waiting period. The transfer of power is automatic. But in this case, the transfer is anything but smooth. At 4:15 p.m., the vice president took the oath of office as president. The ceremony took place not in the White House, but in a conference room inside the Eisenhower Executive Office building, which is adjacent to the White House complex. Why there? Because the former president is still physically occupying the Oval Office and has made it clear he has no intention of leaving. A federal judge administered the oath. The new president swore to faithfully execute the office of President of the United States as required by the Constitution, and with that oath, the constitutional transfer was complete. But the practical transfer, the actual handover of power, has not happened. The new president speaks. Shortly after taking the oath, the new president issued a public statement. It was measured, but firm. The statement called on all federal employees and military personnel to recognize the constitutional chain of command. It called on the former president to respect the Senate's decision and to vacate the White House immediately. The message was clear. The new president considers the former president's continued presence in the White House to be unlawful. This set up a direct confrontation. One person removed by the Senate refusing to leave. Another person sworn in under constitutional authority demanding compliance. One of the most critical players in this crisis is the United States Secret Service. The Secret Service is responsible for protecting the president. But when there are two people claiming to be president, who do they protect? And more importantly, who do they obey? Secret Service Director Kimberly Cheetel issued an emergency directive to all personnel at 4:34 p.m. The directive made the AY's position clear. It stated that the individual sworn in at 4:15 p.m. is the president and will receive full presidential protection. The individual removed by the Senate will receive protection appropriate for former presidents. The directive reminded agents that they protect the office of the presidency, not any individual, and instructed them to facilitate the lawful transition of power. In other words, the Secret Service has sided with the new president. But implementing that directive is proving complicated. According to sources inside the White House, the Secret Service agents currently assigned to the presidential detail are divided. Some have left the White House to join the new president's protection team. Others have remained with the former president. This is unprecedented, For the first time in history, Secret Service agents are on opposite sides of a dispute over who holds the presidency. At 5 p.m., the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff sent a message to all military commanders. The message was unambiguous. It stated that the Senate has convicted and removed the president. It confirmed that under the Constitution, the vice president becomes president upon removal. It directed all military personnel to recognize the constitutional chain of command, which now runs through the individual sworn in at 4:15 p.m. Critically, the message stated that any orders from the individual removed from office are not lawful and will not be obeyed. The military has made its choice. It is following the new president. But the former president responded quickly. At 5:15 p.m., he posted again on social media, asserting that the military works for the commander-in-chief and that he remains the commander-in-chief. He warned that any military personnel who follow orders from the new president are committing mutiny and will face court-martial. This is an extraordinary threat. The former president is attempting to intimidate service members into ignoring the constitutional chain of command. Within hours, the nation's top law enforcement officials began making their positions known. The acting attorney general, who had been appointed by the former president before this crisis began, announced his resignation at 5:34 p.m. He stated that he could no longer serve in a position where the legitimacy of executive authority is disputed. Shortly after, the heads of the FBI, the DEA, the ATF, and the U.S. Marshal Service all announced that they recognize the new president as the lawful executive. The Justice Department, in other words, has chosen the new president. At 6:02 p.m., the new president held a brief press conference. The tone was serious, the message direct. The new president stated, "I am the President of the United States. The Senate has spoken. The Constitution has been followed. I call on the former president to leave the White House peacefully. If he does not, I have directed the U.S. Marshal Service to facilitate his departure. I do not want this to be resolved through force, but the rule of law must be upheld." Translation: if the former president does not leave voluntarily, he will be removed. At 6:17 p.m., U.S. Marshals arrived at the northwest gate of the White House, their mission to execute the new president's directive and remove the former president. But at 6:23 p.m., Secret Service agents, still loyal to the former president, informed the marshals that they will not allow entry. We are now in a standoff. Federal law enforcement acting under orders from the constitutional president is being blocked by other federal agents protecting someone who is constitutionally a former president but refuses to accept that status. So where do we go from here? There are 6 key indicators to watch over the next 24 hours. First, does the former president leave voluntarily? If he walks out on his own, this crisis de-escalates quickly. If he barricades himself inside the White House, the situation becomes far more dangerous. Second, do the Secret Service agents at the White House follow Director Cheatle's directive and stand down? If they do, the marshals can enter and removal can proceed peacefully. If they don't, we could see a physical confrontation between different branches of federal law enforcement. Third, do any military units act independently? If commanders split on who to obey, military cohesion fractures, that would be catastrophic. Fourth, does Congress take action to support the new president? Statements from the House and Senate recognizing the new president would provide political legitimacy and pressure the former president to comply. Fifth, do foreign governments recognize the new president? If key allies issue statements, it adds international weight to the constitutional process and further isolates the former president. Sixth, does the former president support collapse? If cabinet members resign, if agencies refuse his orders, If it becomes clear he cannot govern, he may conclude that resistance is pointless. Let's game out 3 possible scenarios for how this resolves. Scenario 1. The departure. The former president faced with total isolation, a divided Secret Service, a military that won't obey him, agencies that have abandoned him, decides to leave within 24 hours. He'll claim he's being forced out illegally, but he'll comply to avoid the spectacle of physical removal. This is the face-saving exit. Scenario 2. The removal. The U.S. Marshals, with cooperation from Secret Service agents who follow, Director Cheatle's orders enter the White House and escort the former president out. There's no violence, but the images of a former president being physically removed by federal agents become the defining moment of this crisis. This is the enforcement scenario. Scenario 3. The collapse. The former president successfully resists. Secret Service agents refuse to follow Cheatle. The marshals cannot enter. The military splits, with some units recognizing the new president and others continuing to follow the former president. The government operates with 2 competing executives. This is constitutional collapse. The Senate has held presidential impeachment trials before. Andrew Johnson in 1868 was acquitted by a single vote. If he had been convicted, historians agree he would have left office without question. Bill Clinton was acquitted in 1999. Donald Trump was acquitted in both 2020 and 2021. In none of those cases was there a conviction, and in none of those cases did anyone suggest the president would refuse to accept the Senate's verdict. Today is different. For the first time, the Senate convicted. 68 senators voted guilty. The president has been removed under the Constitution, but he refuses to accept it. And so, the country faces a question it has never confronted. How do you enforce removal when the removed president has enough support, enough resources, and enough determination to resist? Here's what is not in dispute. The Senate voted 68 to 32 to convict. 17 Republicans joined all Democrats. Chief Justice Roberts declared the president removed. The vice president was sworn in as president. The former president refuses to accept removal and remains in the White House. The Secret Service is divided. The military has sided with the new president. The Justice Department has sided with the new president. U.S. Marshals are at the White House gate attempting to execute a removal order, and Secret Service agents are blocking them. This is the constitutional crisis at its maximum point. The system worked. The Senate convicted. The constitutional process was followed. But now the enforcement mechanism is being tested. If the former president can remain in the White House, despite Senate conviction, despite being replaced, despite federal law enforcement attempting to remove him, then Senate conviction becomes meaningless. The impeachment power exists in the Constitution, but it cannot be enforced against a president who simply says no. The next 24 hours will reveal whether the United States is still a nation where constitutional processes can constrain executive power, or whether we've learned that power, once seized and held, with enough determination, cannot be dislodged by votes, procedures, or even a 2/3 majority of the Senate. What happens at the White House tonight and tomorrow will answer that question, and that answer will define what kind of country we are. This is not a partisan moment. This is a constitutional moment. Regardless of how you feel about the president, the former president, or the political parties involved, what's happening right now is bigger than any individual or any election. We are watching a test of whether our system of checks and balances can function when someone in power refuses to accept those checks. We are watching whether the rule of law can prevail when confronted by someone who believes they are above it. And we are watching whether centuries of constitutional tradition and precedent can hold in the face of unprecedented defiance. The Senate has exercised the most serious constitutional remedy available. A former president is saying that remedy does not apply to him. One of those positions will prevail, and the outcome will echo for generations.